It starts with silence. Not the kind that soothes, but the kind that hums under your skin, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. In a small town buried beneath the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, there's a name people don't say anymore. It's not written on tombstones, not spoken in churches. It's as if time itself tried to erase it, but secrets they rot slowly, and when they rise, they smell like guilt. In the 1930s, a family lived at the edge of those woods, their windows nailed shut, their children homeschooled by candlelight. Locals whispered that they were strange, too pale, too quiet, eyes too far apart. But the truth went deeper than superstition. Their isolation wasn't a choice. It was a prison built by generations before them, a lineage bound not by love, but by fear of the outside world. Old records describe their ancestors as settlers, proud, industrious. But there's a missing piece, a generation that vanished from the census and then suddenly reappeared decades later, their bloodline twisted by something unnatural, a forbidden tradition buried in the family Bible, a vow that said no outsider should ever taint their purity. What began as pride turned into obsession, and obsession into horror. You see, America is filled with stories like this, not in textbooks but in the soil, in the faded letters hidden in attics and the half-burned photographs no one wants to explain. Every family has secrets. Some just refuse to die. What you're about to hear was never meant to be spoken aloud. It comes from court transcripts sealed for nearly a century, psychiatric reports that disappeared from archives, and a single surviving heir who changed their name and vanished into another life. But history always finds a way to whisper back. And if you listen closely, you might realize this isn't just their story, it's ours. A reflection of what happens when purity becomes poison, when bloodlines become prisons, and when a secret is guarded so long, it starts to change the shape of those who carry it. This is the most disturbing genetic secret. And tonight, we open the door they tried to keep locked forever. They called them the Whitlocks, a name that once held weight in the valleys of Kentucky. Farmers, landowners, churchgoers. The kind of family whose name appeared in every ledger and marriage registry, until one day it didn't. The first sign of something wrong wasn't the whispers, it was the silence. Neighbors stopped visiting. Children weren't seen outside anymore. When mail arrived, no one answered the door, and yet the field stayed tended. Smoke rose from the chimney every night. It was as if the house itself was alive, working in secret, breathing on its own. An old sheriff once told a reporter, decades later, that he remembered hearing faint singing from their property one night. It wasn't English, he said. Didn't sound like church songs either. Sounded like prayer, but not to any God I knew. The next morning, the sheriff rode past the Whitlock barn and found small handprints in the dirt. Far too many for the number of children they were supposed to have. The truth, as it would later unfold, began generations earlier. The patriarch, Ephraim Whitlock, arrived from Virginia in 1847. He brought with him his wife and his sister. Officially, she was listed as a housekeeper, but the birth records from the following years tell a different story. The same names repeating again and again, the same middle initials, the same features described by doctors: malformed jaws, elongated faces, congenital deafness. The bloodline had turned inward, looping on itself until it became a cage. You might imagine that this was all rumor, folklore whispered to scare children. But in 1932, a social worker named Margaret Hill was sent by the state after reports of neglect. What she found inside that house was later described in her private notes. Notes that never made it into the official file. They spoke of children who flinched at sunlight, a mother who muttered verses from Genesis as if they were warnings, and a man who refused to let anyone look into the basement. Margaret didn't return for her follow-up visit. The department closed the case, and the Whitlocks went silent again, until the day the house caught fire. But the fire didn't kill them all. One survived. And with that survivor came the unraveling of the most disturbing genetic secret buried in American history. The survivor was a boy, though by the time rescuers found him, he looked closer to something unearthly. His name was Samuel Whitlock, the youngest of 8, barely 12 years old. They said his skin was so pale it reflected light, and his voice, when he finally spoke, came out cracked, as if unused for years. He was taken to a county hospital 2 towns over. The nurses described him as unnervingly calm. Even when asked about his family, he said only one thing about the fire: they wanted to go home. No one understood what that meant. When pressed about the others, his eyes would wander to the ceiling, as though listening to something that wasn't there. For months, Samuel stayed in state custody. Doctors ran every test they could: blood work, psychological evaluations. The reports, which later vanished from the official record, showed anomalies no one could explain. His DNA contained recessive traits not typically compatible with life. Yet, there he was, silent, breathing, staring. One geneticist who briefly examined him wrote in the margins of his notes, "Breeding this extensive should have ended the line. The fact that it didn't may be the strangest part of all." The doctors weren't the only ones interested. In 1933, representatives from a eugenics research program, one of several operating quietly across the U.S. at the time, requested custody of the boy for study. It was an era when purity and progress were often spoken in the same sentence, and men in white coats believed they could cleanse humanity through selective bloodlines. Samuel was exactly what they were looking for, proof of what happened when a family refused to mix with the world beyond their walls. But Samuel didn't make it to the facility. He disappeared the night before the transfer. A nurse on duty claimed she saw him walking down the hospital corridor barefoot, muttering scripture, his hospital gown streaked with ash. She swore the last thing he said before turning the corner was, "You can't fix what God already cursed." His body was never found. A week later, the Eugenics Institute burned to the ground in an unexplained electrical fire. Witnesses said they saw a single boy standing in the field nearby, just watching. After that, the Whitlock name became a ghost story. But in the 1970s, a genealogist stumbled upon something that would reopen the case and prove the bloodline didn't end with Samuel. The genealogist's name was Dr. Alan Reeves, a quiet academic with an obsession for forgotten lineages. He wasn't looking for horror, he was looking for patterns. But in the spring of 1974, buried in a stack of decaying courthouse archives, he found a document that shouldn't have existed, a marriage certificate dated 1951. The groom's name, Samuel Whitlock. At first, Reeves assumed it was a clerical error. The fire, the missing person report, none of it aligned. But the signatures matched perfectly. Even the handwriting was identical to the surviving hospital records. According to that marriage license, Samuel had resurfaced 20 years after he supposedly vanished, under a new name, in a new state. The woman he married was from a rural town in Ohio. She was 23 kind. Unremarkable. A school teacher. Within 2 years, she gave birth to a son, then a daughter. Both were healthy, normal even, until the daughter turned 9. That's when the neighbors began to whisper about her eyes. About how she'd sit in the yard for hours, staring at the sky as if waiting for something to come down. Reeves traced every record he could find: school reports, tax filings, hospital visits. But then, just as the trail grew clear, the entire family disappeared. No forwarding address, no death certificates, nothing. The only clue left behind was a letter, found in a local library donation box years later, handwritten in Samuel's old-fashioned script. It read, "You can change your name, you can change your face, but blood remembers." Reeves spent the rest of his career chasing that bloodline, convinced that descendants still walked among ordinary people, blending into the crowd. His students thought he was delusional. Colleagues mocked him. But before his death in 1991, Reeves gave a final interview to a regional paper. The article never went to print, but the transcript survived in his personal effects. He said, "There are families in America whose roots never left the 1800s. They've kept their rituals, their purity. The Whitlocks were not unique, just careless. Every time we look away from what came before, we let it happen again." The interviewer asked him what he meant by it. Reeves just smiled and said, "Look into your own family tree. If you find gaps where names should be, don't dig. Some lines aren't meant to be traced." And then, just like the Whitlocks, his name vanished from the records too. By the late 1990s, the Whitlock legend had drifted into the realm of local folklore. A bedtime warning told in hushed tones across the Appalachian region. Teenagers dared each other to visit the ruins of the old house, now nothing more than a blackened foundation buried in ivy. They said if you stood there at midnight and whispered your own last name 3 times, you'd hear another name whispered back, one you'd never heard before, but somehow recognized. For decades it stayed just that, a ghost story, until a small town reporter named Lisa Carrington stumbled upon Dr. Reeves's abandoned research files. The boxes had been auctioned off after his estate was cleared, sold for a few dollars along with yellowed journals and family charts scrawled in fading ink. Among them was a single photograph, a black and white portrait of a family taken sometime in the 1960s. A man, a woman, and 2 children. Their faces were blurred slightly, maybe from age, maybe from something else. But in the corner of the photo, faintly written in pencil, was a name: S. Whitlock. Lisa began to dig. The deeper she went, the less sense it made. Hospital records from Ohio, Virginia, and Kentucky contained inconsistencies. Birth certificates missing parent names, fingerprints mismatched between identities that should have been separate. And yet, they all shared a single detail. The same blood type, the same rare recessive genetic marker first identified in Samuel's hospital file. It shouldn't have been possible. DNA testing was still primitive, but even preliminary analysis confirmed it. Someone carrying Whitlock blood had survived into the 1990s, and they weren't hiding in the woods anymore. They were in cities, schools, jobs, living ordinary lives. Lisa's notes became increasingly erratic after that. She wrote about receiving unmarked envelopes, each containing a single photograph of herself, taken from outside her apartment window. She told her editor she felt watched, paranoid. Within months, she resigned from her paper and left town. Her last email to a colleague read simply, "I don't think the Whitlocks ever died. I think they learned how to blend in." A year later, a family photo was found in her old apartment. 4 faces, smiling, but when investigators compared it to known Whitlock images from the past, they noticed something horrifying. The eyes were the same, the spacing, the shape. The impossible, inherited symmetry that should have ended generations ago. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? In 2003, a cold case investigator named Daniel Hurst reopened what was left of the Whitlock file. He wasn't chasing myths, he was chasing a pattern. Over a span of 20 years, there had been dozens of unsolved disappearances across Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia. People who lived alone, people with no immediate family. Every case had one strange detail in common: the missing person had recently ordered DNA testing kits through early genealogy services. Hurst began cross-referencing old Whitlock records with modern genetic data, back when those databases were still loosely regulated. What he found chilled him. Certain users, under different names, in different states, all showed genetic sequences nearly identical to the extinct Whitlock line. The odds of that happening randomly were 1 in several billion, and yet the data was there. The bloodline hadn't vanished. It had evolved, hidden in plain sight. He tried to contact some of those users. Only one responded, a woman from rural Indiana named Claire. She agreed to meet him in person. She was polite, articulate, normal by every measure. But during their conversation, Hurst noticed her eyes, a faint gray ring around the irises, the same discoloration described in early Whitlock medical reports. When he asked about her family, she smiled and said, "We don't keep records anymore. Records cause problems." A week later, Hurst disappeared. His car was found abandoned at the edge of the same mountain range where the original Whitlock house once stood. The GPS was still on, still guiding him toward coordinates listed in Reeves's old notes, a site labeled Origin Point. The only thing found inside the car was a cassette tape. When analysts played it, there was no voice, no music, just the sound of breathing, soft, steady, rhythmic. But halfway through the tape, a faint whisper emerged, one that repeated a phrase again and again, growing clearer with each cycle. "Blood remembers, blood remembers, blood remembers." To this day, the tape remains sealed in evidence storage. The FBI never released the full recording to the public, citing ongoing forensic review. But those who've heard it privately say the final minute contained something else. A child's laughter, echoing through static, ending abruptly as if someone had cut the tape by hand. That was the last known trace of the Whitlocks. Until last year, when a new genetic anomaly appeared in modern databases, one matching Samuel's exact profile. The database flag came from an ancestry kit mailed out of Denver, Colorado. The user was anonymous, but the DNA markers were unmistakable. The same cluster of recessive genes, the same genetic distortion that scientists once believed incompatible with life. Statistically impossible unless the bloodline had been preserved intentionally. The lab technician who first caught the anomaly, a young woman named Erin Walsh, assumed it was an error. But as she dug deeper, she discovered 3 more matches from different states: Illinois, Oregon, and Pennsylvania, all tied to the same root strain. When she alerted her supervisor, the account files were immediately locked, then erased. The following morning, Erin received a phone call from an unlisted number. The voice on the other end said quietly, "Stop asking questions about them. Some families don't die, they adapt." A week later, her apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen except her laptop and the physical DNA sample. Erin's story leaked onto fringe internetums in 2021, dismissed as conspiracy. But an independent geneticist obtained fragments of the deleted data and published a short report. His conclusion was terrifyingly simple: the genome showed evidence of deliberate manipulation, generations of controlled breeding, likely self-contained, guided by an internal set of rules. The Whitlocks hadn't just survived their curse, they'd learned to perfect it. Somewhere in America, there are people who look ordinary, who go to work, raise families, live among us, yet carry in their cells the echo of a bloodline that once vowed never to mix with the outside world. The deformities are gone, the traces of isolation erased, but the psychological traits remain: secrecy, control, and an instinct to protect the purity of their kind at any cost. It's said that once every generation, one descendant breaks the pattern, runs, tries to disappear, tries to live as someone else, and each time they're found. sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. The Whitlocks don't punish traitors, they absorb them. If you've ever looked at your family tree and found gaps, years missing, names redacted, maybe it's because someone didn't want you to see what's buried there. Maybe you were never meant to know who your ancestors really were. And maybe the bloodline never stopped watching. By 2023, the Whitlock mystery had mutated into a kind of digital folklore, whispered across Reddit threads, late-night podcasts, and private genealogy circles. Most dismissed it as a story meant to spook amateur historians. But among the noise, one post stood out. It came from an anonymous user calling themselves Ashfromaden. The post included scans of old letters, dated 1892, signed by Ephraim W., the original patriarch. The handwriting matched perfectly to preserve samples. The letters weren't confessions, they were instructions. They outlined rules for maintaining what he called the covenant of the blood. No outsiders, no dilution. A vow that every Whitlock child would be born of Whitlock seed. The post went viral for one night, then disappeared, account deleted, files scrubbed. But archived fragments revealed something chilling. Ephraim's final letter included a prophecy of sorts, claiming that the family would endure until the blood itself learns to hide. That phrase haunted historians for months, because if you read it not as mysticism but biology, it makes sense: survival through adaptation, mutation, the perfect disguise. The Whitlocks may have become indistinguishable from the rest of us, their physical markers erased through centuries of subtle inbreeding and selective pairing. Yet deep within their genome, the code of the covenant still whispers. One geneticist described it this way: they may look like us, sound like us, even marry us, but something ancient and self-protective sits dormant inside them, an instinct that remembers isolation as survival. Reports of strange gatherings began surfacing again: remote cabins, family reunions close to outsiders, dozens of identical invitations mailed across state lines, all signed with a single symbol, an interlocked W burned into parchment. The return addresses were fake, but postmarks proved they came from within the same 3 counties that once formed the Whitlock estate. When investigators visited one of those sites, they found nothing but animal bones, arranged in concentric circles, each smaller than the last, like a spiral folding in on itself. At the center, a single child's handprint pressed into dried clay. No fingerprints were ever matched, no one claimed responsibility, and just like before, silence returned. But silence doesn't mean peace. It just means the blood has gone quiet again, waiting. A few months later, a podcast host named Ryan Kincaid decided to devote an episode to the Whitlock legend. He called it The Family That Shouldn't Exist. It started like any other investigative piece, skeptical, structured, built on old newspaper clippings and folklore. But as the episodes went on, Ryan's tone shifted. The final recordings never aired. What survived was pieced together by his editor from raw audio files found on his laptop, recovered after his disappearance. In those recordings, Ryan's voice sounds different, slower, deliberate, as if something unseen was sitting just behind him. He talks about finding descendants who refused interviews, about a sealed church registry in Kentucky that the diocese wouldn't release, and about a woman who contacted him claiming to be a guardian of the covenant. She warned him that truth is not a gift, it's an infection. Then, Ryan describes being followed. Same car, same driver, every day for a week. He stopped sleeping. In one late-night entry, he whispers into the microphone, "They know I've read the letters. They know I've seen the real names. It's not just a story. They've never left us. They've only learned to wear our faces." At the end of the final tape, there's a sound, something like knocking, 3 slow raps. Ryan breathes heavily, mutters a prayer, and says, "If this reaches anyone, burn your records. Forget your name." Blood remembers. The next morning, his apartment was found empty. No signs of struggle. The only thing left was his computer, wiped clean except for a single folder titled Inheritance. Inside were 12 audio files, all corrupted, and 1 text document. 3 words: The Covenant Lives. And after that, every podcast platform hosting his earlier episodes received DMCA takedown notices from a law firm that doesn't exist in any registry. Even archive backups vanished, every trace erased as if the story itself was being recalled. And yet, listeners still report something strange. When you play one of Ryan's deleted files, if you can find them, there's a low hum beneath the static. Some say it's just feedback. Others say it's breathing. But a few swear it's whispering a name. Not Whitlock, your name. There's a reason this story refuses to fade. It isn't just about a single cursed family. It's about what happens when a nation decides to forget the rot under its own roots. The Whitlocks were never truly unique. They were simply the first to be noticed, the first to be documented, the first to be whispered about in government halls under the phrase genetic containment. Because buried in the archives of the 1930s eugenics programs, there's evidence that other families, dozens of them, were monitored in silence, not because they were victims, but because they'd become something else. Entire lineages that closed their blood to outsiders and built their own rituals, their own science, their own gospel of inheritance. When researchers dug into those programs years later, most of the files were gone. But one memo survived. It said, "Subjects have achieved stability. Recommend observation only. Interference would risk integration failure." Integration, a polite word for assimilation, for the moment when isolation finally walks among us. So maybe the Whitlocks didn't die out. Maybe they did exactly what Ephraim promised in his final letter. They learned to hide. Maybe they became doctors, teachers, soldiers. Maybe one sits beside you at work. Maybe one raised you. The blood doesn't announce itself anymore. It doesn't deform or reveal. It waits buried in DNA, passed quietly through generations until it's triggered by chance or by ritual. Some believe those gatherings still happen, far from cameras, deep in the woods where the signal dies and the stars look too close. They say descendants meet in silence, not to pray, but to remember, to keep the covenant alive. And every few years someone disappears, someone who looked too closely, someone who thought this was only meth. The pattern repeats, generation after generation, like the echo of a secret America keeps trying to bury. Because this isn't just a story about bloodlines. It's about the cost of purity and the horror of what humanity becomes when it refuses to mix, to change, to forgive. The Whitlocks didn't vanish. They simply became the reflection in the mirror that no longer looks quite like you, but almost does. And that's the most disturbing truth of all. That maybe the real secret isn't that they survived, it's that we did.